And now we go to our keynote of today, Professor Katarina Kunda from Helsinki University. And even though the university is Finland, we have a guest from Germany, and you have worked many years in Germany, and is a astonished church historian with a great insight into church diplomacy in Europe, which you will also highlight in this presentation. I think I gave it the title, actually. The Churches in European Diplomacy, War and Peace Building, from the Helsinki Accord to the War in Ukraine. Of course, based on, this is also the anniversary of the signing of the Helsinki Accord. So, Professor Kunda, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Good. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, for the invitation. It means a lot for me to be here with you in Nyborg today. And you cannot know this, but my academic journey in the field of contemporary church history, or church history itself, began with the CAC. And it was in 1992, my professor of church history in that time, it was Martin Greschert, asked me if I would accompany him on a research trip to Geneva and assist him. My final exam were only half a year away, but of course with such a request you do not say no. So we arrived in 1992 in Geneva. We had a chat with the then General Secretary John Fisher, who was very surprised about these two German researchers, but was open and talkative, but not particularly interested in history. So the very friendly Inge, I do not know her back name, but I remember her pre-name, Inge from the Keck, then took us to the small cellar of the Ecumenical Center, where then the history of the Keck was stored in dusty, very legible files. And my job was to look through them and copy the information. Nobody of us two actually knew something of the Keck. Martin Greschert had come across the Keck because he was from the Westphalian Landeskirche and had some connections with Prince Ernst Wilhelm, who was one of the founding members of the Keck. But I had never heard about the Keck. But when I started to read the papers and all the thoughts I made in this period in the archive in between, it fascinated me, and it left a long-lasting mark on my own professional biography. So, of course, I also read the original documents from Nyborg I, from January 1948. There were 50 representatives of 42 churches here in Nyborg, as well as the files and document of Nyborg II in 1960, and then Nyborg III in 1962, and then also the plans and all the developments for Nyborg V. But then Nyborg V, as you have heard, took then place on the boat Bornholm because of the visa problems. But never I could have imagined at that time, when I was a young student, that one day I myself would stand here in Nyborg. And also I did not know that the name of Nyborg was a name of the hotel. I learned that just in this meeting. So that I will be standing here for you and addressing something about and in a historical perspective on the Keck. That is why it matters for me to be here with you today, and also why it matters when you are doing church history, and especially these contemporary church history issues, if you have a personal connections, because I'm not an agnostic church historian. Of course, I'm a member of the churches, and I feel myself as a Christian church historian. So I thank you very warmly for the invitation, and also I thank you very much for the genuine interest in your own history as the Keck. And I know from long years working with institutions and churches, it is anything than self-evident. And then on the other side, to my knowledge of the Keck, I think it suits the Keck more than any other ecumenical organization, because the constant revolving around its own mission and identity is something that runs through the 60 years of the Keck. I speak today from an outside perspective to you. I'm a church historian, and what drives me is to understand history and its actors, and I try to understand them appropriately in their time and on the basis of sources, but of course always with the questions and the perspectives and dialogue of today. When I was starting to work in 1992, and then I came much more often later to doing my PhD, 1945, and then 94, and a couple of other times, always in those cellars in Geneva, and I was trying to follow the traces of the KEK. But in that time, I remember that very clearly in 92, when I was the first time in Geneva, very little of the historical upheavals of Central Europe could be felt in the city. Geneva was calm, still breathing, at least that was my perception, the international spirit of the 1920s. One could live there very well without being deeply touched by the transformations that had taken place in Central Europe since the mid-1980s. And in that time, in the beginning of the 1990s, it seemed as though a particular interpretation of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act has triumphed. The British historian Timothy Garton-Ash, with his books about the revolution from 1989, argued that it was a revolution of freedom and a victory of Central European civil society. The communist dictatorships had collapsed in 1989 at the latest. The borders of Europe were open, much was in transition, and almost everything seemed possible. Human rights, democracy, peace, and freedom in Europe were not longer a vision. They were expected to be firmly anchored in Europe for the long term. Out of this conviction, the Charter of Paris was signed in November 1919, still with the signature of the Soviet Union, at the closing document of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The division of Europe was over. Democracy seemed to be established as the only legitimate form of government. It was, in every sense, a turning point into a good time. And I was happy to be a young person in that time. Today, in 2025, we once again find ourselves at a turning point. We look back at 50 years since the Helsinki Final Act of August 1975, and 35 years since the hopeful new beginnings of the 1990s in Europe. In June, we gathered in Helsinki at a major conference where the KEK was also represented through you, Mr. Fischbach, and we recalled hope, how years of diplomacy, how civil courage and deep trust in democracy had led to a high point of détente in Europe and had filled the Helsinki Final Act with life. And yet, at the same time, it was clear to all of us today that Europe is in danger of losing everything that Helsinki once stood for. The experience from a diplomatic negotiation process lasting several years, the 3 baskets finally formulated, and the 10 principles of Helsinki, just to mention the inviolability of borders, the territorial integrity of states, the peaceful settlement of conflicts, and not least, the universal validity of human rights and freedom of religion, opinion, and conscience, are being violated in a most dramatic way today. With its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia is attacking not only the state and the people of Ukraine, but also the very foundations of freedom and peace in Europe. And at the same time, we see a global decline in trust in a rule-based international order, whether through Russia's or China's imperial law of the strongest, or through ugly authoritarian isolationism, to which we must now count also the United States, among others. For Christians and for the churches of Europe, this situation demands clarity. Where did we stand along the way? Where do we stand today? What is our role and our contribution to freedom, peace, and security in civil society and in diplomacy, from the CSCE all the way to the war in Ukraine? Nothing less is at stake than the future of Europe, freedom, security, and the core ideas that have shaped the European Union since the post-war era, the rule of law, democracy, and pluralism. I will give some answers, or at least try to give some answers, from out the history. And I will introduce you in this long history of the KEK and making some points. First of all, about the myth and the reality about the KEK as a child of the Cold War. Then I will turn to Helsinki of 1975. I will address the conference in Basel in 1989 as a turning point, raise some reflections about the churches between adaptation and criticism, and finally look to the period after 1990, which I will label as crisis and reorientation. And I start with some thoughts about the history, and it fits very well that we had now the plaquette and all the historical reflections. Then with that, you can see that it has been often said that the KEK was a child of the Cold War. And I think on the one hand, of course, this is true, because nearly half of its members came from socialist countries of the Eastern Bloc, and so the KEK reflected the political division of Europe after 1945. But then on the other side, I think this child of the Cold War expression is also true in political terms and views. When the KEK was founded in January 1949, after preliminary talks, and Peter was already remembering that in 1953 and 1957, and right here in this very hotel, Europe was shaken by the second Berlin crisis. You may not remember that, so I'm just raising some thoughts about that. In November 1948, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had demanded the withdrawal of the Allied troops from Berlin and the signing of a peace treaty with Germany. West Berlin was to become a free and demilitarized city. By January 1948, same month when the KEK here was founded, the Soviet Union had presented a draft peace treaty aiming at the recognition of the GDR and the neutralization and demilitarization of Germany and the acceptance of the Oder-Neiße as Germany's final eastern border. Negotiations between the Western powers and the Soviet Union led to nowhere. Even the meeting in Vienna in June 1961 between John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev was unsuccessful. When Khrushchev issued another ultimatum, Kennedy responded with his three essentials vision: free access to Berlin, the presence of Western forces in the city, and the freedom of its people must not be compromised. The answer of the Soviet Union and the GDR came quickly. On 13 August 1961, the GDR was built the Berlin Wall. I mention this in such detail not only because it shows a pattern of Soviet hegemonial politics offering neutrality in exchange for Western armament, but also because it makes clear in what kind of context the KEK was founded. It was a time when churches in communist countries were under heavy repression, when uprisings in East Germany in 1943, in Poland and Hungary in 1956, and then in Prague 1968, were brutally crushed down by Soviet forces. And very far away, when we are looking on the global scale, in January 1959, Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba with weapons and revolutionary troops. Where were the churches in all this? The men, unfortunately no women, who were in the process of founding and institutionalizing the KEK, and most of them were coming, let's say, from a German-speaking background, or at least of countries neighboring Germany. But these men knew that politically they could not change these realities. But what they could do, and what they wanted to do, was to create a space where Christians from East and West could speak, meet, pray, and learn together. The KEK became, in a sense, a sort of West Berlin for the churches, a place of freedom and fellowship in Christ, across the dividing wall, across the Iron Curtain. With this approach, the CAC distinguished itself from the Christian Peace Conference, the CPC, which was founded just a year earlier in 1948 by the Czech theologian Josef Hromadka, together with some German theologians from the Confessional Church, just to mention names like Niemöller or Gollwitzer, maybe some of you recall also Ewand. The Christian Peace Conference was supported financially by the Soviet Union, and it became increasingly an instrument of what we would nowadays label as Soviet soft power, promoting disarmament and peace in line with the Soviet Union policy. In today's language, we might also call the Christian Peace Conference an element of Moscow's hybrid warfare. But yet, at the time, the Christian Peace Conference was also, and that is the other side we also have to take in mind, it was an attractive platform because it offered a rare space where Christians in East and West could meet together. And not at least Glenn Garfield Williams, the long-serving CAC General Secretary at the time, was also a member of the Christian Peace Conference. So the CAC wanted something different. The CAC wanted to be less politicized, less pro-Soviet, more pastoral. And at the same time, it saw itself as a sort of pan-European intellectual and spiritual alternative to the European communities, which were at that time quite small in scale, because the UK, Denmark, and Norway and Ireland were just becoming members in 1972 and 73. So the CAC also offered a platform before those countries were entering the European Union. And in the long run, especially after crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968, I think this concept of the CAC proved successful, at least when we are looking on the history of the institutions. Nowadays, the conference of the Christian Peace Conference do not longer exist, but the CAC survived. Still, it was never easy for the CAC to remain neutral in a bipolar world. Political statements had to be made by an unspoken consensus and usually turned into a very general and therefore, I would say, ineffective statements about peace and detente. The representatives of social Central and Eastern Europe were not only under considerable pressure from the state in their countries, but also ensured socialism-friendly interpretations and pushed the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. A second point, this became very clear in the whole process of the Helsinki Security Conference, which began in the mid of the 1960s onward, and it was a project which was increasingly promoted by the Soviet Union and its socialist allies of the Warsaw Pact. Only a few weeks after the Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had spoken in favor of opening negotiations on the question of European security, an initiative which was confirmed by the Bucharest Declaration in 6 July in 1966, the topic of European security appeared for the first time on the agenda of the CAC. At the preparatory meeting held from December 8 to December 11, 1966, in anticipation of the 5th General Assembly in Purchach, scheduled for October 1967, Metropolit Filaret from the Soviet Union urged that the problems of European security should be addressed by the CAC. After all, he argued, the CAC was indeed a conference of European churches. The call was then taken up in the General Assembly in Purchach, held from September 29 to October 5, 1967, and it declared, I quote, "Even though we can thankfully observe a certain relaxation of tensions in Europe in recent years, we propose, as a further possibility of reconciliation and as a practical step towards strengthening peace, a conference of the European heads of government." With this statement, the CEC became demonstrably the first church body to support the European Security Conference. Yet it did so in alignment with the Christian Peace Conference and with the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, whose primary concern was the legal recognition of the status quo and the post-war borders of Europe. So, for example, in Perchach in 1967, the Russian Orthodox Metropolitan Alexei II argued in the spirit of Khrushchev's concept of a peaceful coexistence, a concept that has been propagated since 1956, and using the familiar phrase, peace and cooperation among European people must be guaranteed with an effective system of European security. There was nothing inherently wrong with this phrase, if you look at them in isolation and without a context. But in this ideological interpretation of the Soviet Union, peaceful coexistence did not mean mutual recognition or true good neighborhood between different political systems. Rather, it meant only a transitional phase, tolerated for pragmatic reasons, during which socialist and non-socialist states could coexist, always with the exception and the expectation that capitalism would collapse and communism would prevail. It was a smart announcement of the ultimate victory of communism and the Soviet Union. So the concept of peace was even vague then in 1967 in Perchach, and more importantly, it was not filled with theological meaning. How such a peace in Europe might be secured through a system of European security became in the years that followed one of the most widely debated and at the same time one of the most problematic questions within the CEC. Or to quote in the words of the CEC itself from 1977, how can a constructive critical solidarity be developed among the churches as a contribution to détente? This solidarity includes fraternal openness and mutual assistance, but it also demands the creation of a durable relationship of trust among the churches. That sounds very familiar to the questions we are facing here today in our conference, and where we hopefully will get further than the CEC did back then. Because in my view, the CEC never found a convincing Christian answer to this question, not until the end of the Cold War. When the Helsinki Final Act was signed on August 1st in 1975 by 35 heads of state and government, they committed themselves to principles such as territorial integrity, peaceful conflict settlement, non-interference, human rights, and religious freedom. Yet, despite that, the language of peaceful coexistence continued to dominate the CEC statements, its study programs, and many, many conferences. Peace. But it was a peace without reference to the humanitarian dimension of the Final Act of Helsinki. It was a peace without criticism of dictatorship. It was a peace without confronting violations of human rights or religious freedom. The CEC, provided unable to face the conflict-ridden reality of this bipolar time and to translate it into concrete terms. The only way forward seemed to be settled on consensus formulas, and formulas as such that, quote, the European security need the full support of the churches, or that, quote, the CEC itself should serve as a bridge for meetings, exchanges and consultations among church representatives from East and West. They still worked in some well-resourced national European churches, but was not very convincing in an increasingly secularized European society. Seen from a historical perspective, this was also an attempt to create a shared spiritual and ecclesiastical dimension that transcended political boundaries. But the question remains, however, whether this was even possible in the bipolarity of the Cold War and the ideological antagonisms of two competing systems. The central theme of the KEK's engagement with the CSCE process remained the theme of peace. Only very late, and later as other non-state organizations, and I just mentioned the Vatican, or I also mentioned the Lutheran World Federation, did human rights gradually emerge after the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, and as one as the essential topics and themes for the KEK. This coincident with an increasingly perception and acceptance of human rights in the churches. And here, for example, the German Protestantism was miles behind what the CCIA had already recognized immediately after the Second World War. But the fact that it was so difficult for Christian churches to accept the UN Human Rights Declaration of 1948 as secular law also applied to other churches. Human rights in that time remained for the KEK an abstract subject, usually discussed without references to concrete cases of human rights violations or restrictions on religious freedom in Central and Eastern Europe. Indeed, one could even detect in these debates a tendency to relative and to downplay the subject. Within the KEK, the Western liberal concept of human rights was treated as equivalent to the state socialist understanding of collective rights. Finally, in February 1979, the constitutive meeting for the Working Committee for the Church's Human Rights Program for the implementation of the Helsinki Final Act was held. This marked the beginning of a new phase of the KEK involvement in the CSCE process. The chair of this program was Christa Leweck, a delegate from the German Democratic Republic. She was among those East German Protestants who confidently promoted, within the ecumenical movement, the concept of a church within socialism, and who therefore displayed very strong political loyalty to the East German communist state. This was characteristic for the KEK in that period. On the one hand, the program signaled greater responsibility for the subjects of human rights that had previously been avoided out of fear of division and withdrawal. But on the other side, the paralyzing grip of the systemic antagonisms once again made itself felt. Thus, it was quickly agreed that the program could not deal with individual cases of human rights violation in Europe, and the same story applies also for the World Council of Churches. And it was decided that human rights must be understood as both individual and social. But this also meant that there would be no political pressure against human rights violations in Eastern Europe and no support for Christian dissidents there. From 1967 onwards, such dissidents were numerous, Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox alike. Think, for example, the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, or the Moscow or the Ukrainian Helsinki group. They appealed to the Final Act of Helsinki as a legally binding document signed by their governments, and they demanded democracy, human rights, religious freedom, and the rule of law from their own governments. The courageous statements of the Christian dissidents had consequences for them. They found themselves marginalized within church, ecumenical circles, and social life. They lost their authorization to serve as pastors or went into prison. They were excluded, as one former KEK thinker, the Dutch Protestant Laurens Hogebrink, has put it, they were excluded in a double way, excluded from their own societies and excluded from the ecumenical fellowship. And yet, on the other hand, by their commitment to human rights and democracy, they kept alive the hope of political change. At the same time, they bore witness to the fact that, even under conditions of a communist dictatorship, it was possible to remain an authentic, uncompromising Christian community in the underground. At our conference in Helsinki in June, we were still able to hear some of the surviving members of these Helsinki groups with a Christian background. These groups were a movement from below. They embodied, as I said it in the beginning, the emergence of an East European civil society. And I come to my third point, the CAC between adaptation and criticism. The churches and their ecumenical organization, and that applies to all the ecumenical organization, if it is the CAC, the World Council of Churches, or the Lutheran World Federation, or the Reformed World Federation, are always moving within a field of tension, and they are caught between adaptation and criticism. On the one hand, after Helsinki in 1975, many new opportunity opened up for East-West encounters and ecumenical meetings. Travel became indeed easier. Because the Helsinki Final Act emphasized the humanitarian dimension and fostered East-West encounters, the churches too gained new significance. The 1970s and 80s saw an ecumenical conference boom, and churches themselves became part of the détente process. As a result, and that is also something we had not seen in the time, but as a result of these new significance, the cracks of secularization in Europe were not so visible in this period. But then, on the other hand, after Helsinki in 1975, international tensions between East and West sharpened again. Dissidents, Christians in Eastern Europe experienced harsher repression. Many emigrated to the West. Inside the churches at home, within the communist countries, conflicts deepened. Conflicts between groups and church leadership, between young and old. These were the moments of truth. These situations in which there were sufferers, victims, and those left alone. They were the nonconformists, the dissidents, or the young people, for example in the GDR, who wore the forbidden sticker swords into Blackshaw in the 1980s and faced repression. Neither the CAC nor the World Council of Churches could position themselves clearly on this side, and also not the church leaderships of the East and the West German state. The Lutheran World Federation, however, was more outspoken because it placed religious freedom at the center of the engagement and used the humanitarian dimension of the Final Act. And now I come to the turning point of Basel 1989 and the time of change. It came indeed a turning point in the history of the CAC with the first European Ecumenical Assembly in Basel in May 1989. It was, as I guess you know, organized by the CAC and the Council of the European Bishop Conferences. And the Assembly formed a part of the consular process for peace, justice, and the integrity of creation, and therefore had the title Peace and Justice. For the first time in centuries, all the major Christian churches of Europe came together: Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans. Around 5,000 participants were present, and 700 delegates were officially appointed. Basel was animated by the vision of a common house, a phrase and an idea shaped by Mikhail Gorbachev. Many who were in Basel felt something new was beginning. People from East and West met one another, exchanged experiences, and spoke about their hope and their fears. Formally, Christian dissidents were not invited, but informally, few encounters took place. In workshops and open forums, representatives from Poland, the GDR, Hungary and Lithuania spoke. It became clear that the Eastern Bloc was by no means homogeneous. And in the same time in Poland, free elections were already prepared, while in the GDR, everything seemed to be locked in place. Basel was both an expression of the growing civil society in Eastern Europe, and in its final Basel document, it was a voice that gave shape to a new idea, the idea that the churches are part of this civil society. It was a new concept at the time, and also the wording of civil society was new in that time. Churches, and that was the new idea, churches were no longer simply part of the old top-down order, aligned through the hierarchy with the state authorities, but were now placed themselves below and at the grassroots, working from the bottom up and engaging with society directly. Only a few moments later, during the revolutions of 1989, it became clear what this might mean and where the power and the dynamics of the churches lay. Many who had been present in Basel and later told their story experienced Basel in the spring of 1989 as a part of that history of awakening, which would soon lead into the Paris Charter of 1990. After 1990, with the end of the Cold War, the roles of the churches changed radically. The ecumenical movement lost much of its importance, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Contacts with Geneva or Brussels were no longer necessary for travel or support. At the same time, it became evident how closely some of the church representatives in the East had been tied to the regimes, a reality that led to a loss of trust. The CEC had to find a new orientation. The creation of the European single market in 1993, the EU enlargement in the East in 2004, and the growing importance of church representation in European affairs, especially in Brussels, paved the way for a fundamental restructuring after 1990. This affected, above all, the old structure and also the role of the CEC. From now on, it opened itself more strongly to the issues and field of the European Union, positioning itself with offices in Brussels and Strasbourg. In 1999, the CEC and the European Ecumenical Commission for Church and Society merged to form a new Commission of Church and Society in the CEC with its own representation in Brussels and Strasbourg. The Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe was also integrating into this new structure and being present in Brussels. The call, launched in 1990 by Jacques Delors, then the president of the European Commission, was a milestone for the churches. He appealed to the Christian churches of Europe to contribute to the search for the heart and soul of Europe. This appeal brought with it a new political appreciation of the churches. It also led the CEC, which during the Cold War had shown very little sympathy for the European integration project, to work more closely with the European institutions, seeking to bring the voices of the churches into the integration process. With the Charta Ecumenica in 2001, so 10 years after the Paris Charter of 1990, the CEC, together with the European Bishops' Conference, together affirmed their commitment to democracy, to pluralism, and to religious freedom. But today, and since the Charta Ecumenica, Europe has changed. In the year 2025, the war in the Ukraine is the greatest challenge to peace and security in Europe. Russia is fundamentally violating all the principles of Helsinki: human rights, religious freedom, territorial integrity, and all of these are systematically disregarded and violated. It is, in a whole, an attack on humanity. How do the churches respond? In my opinion, the World Council of Churches struggles and relies still on the first-track diplomacy known from the Cold War, as far as I have seen. However, but this is not a lecture about the World Council of Churches, I think what worked well maybe in the Cold War period did not work so well in a completely different European society in the beginning of the 21st century. The KEK, however, at least from my outside perspective, also tried going the same way and arguing and developing itself on the first track, and tried to do that in the beginning of the war, but has undergone a change in recent years. With programs like the Pathways to Peace, it is no longer in search of dialogues in these terms of peaceful coexistence, primarily on the level of church leadership, even if they are present, and not only on the track 1 level of diplomacy. Instead, it turns maybe much more to the level 2 and definitely more to the level 3, turns to civil society and towards the victims of the war, to churches in Ukraine, to local initiatives. Network meetings supporting educational work and finding a new Christian, and at the same time broadly and also in the secular world understandable language of what it does mean to be a Christian today in Europe. It is, as I see it in my historical perspective, definitely a new approach in comparison to the Cold War self-understanding of the KEK. Looking back, one thing is clear. Churches and their organizations have made an essential, often ambivalent contribution to European reconciliation and unification. They created spaces for encounter. They kept alive the spirit of Helsinki. They placed human rights on the agenda, though often hesitantly. The contribution was less about interventions of power politics and more about processes of education, about forums for dialogue, about support for local congregations. And today, once again, it became evident. The commitment to pluralism, to democracy, to the rule of law, and to just peace remains as urgent as ever. Precisely in the face of a war at the very heart of Europe, the validity of the Helsinki principles is called into questions now. So, coming to my last remarks, can we learn something from that history? First of all, I think historical memories, reflections, and analyses bring in some ways freedom. It protects us from myths and illusions, and hopefully makes us more sensible and hopefully also more critical. I think that history makes us free to be open in the present, because we are not forced to rely on concepts of the past. Second, churches always had and have a double role: dialogue partners of the powerful, but also supporters of the weak. Too often in the Cold War period, the second role was neglected. It would be a convincing sign for the non-Christian world, but also for the Christian community, if this were to be changed. Third, the principles of Helsinki are more relevant than ever. The churches in Europe should make them fully their own, and they should represent them in the public. This also requires the insight that Europe matters. In past decades, within the discourse of globalization and post-colonialism, European themes were often dismissed in ecumenical circles, and that is also the case, and especially in the World Council of Churches with its global scale in the 1970s and 80s. But it must be in the interest of the KEK to show itself more clearly as the representative of the churches in Europe, without carrying a guilty conscience toward Africa, Asia, or the global South. That does not mean that we give up our solidarity with those suffering there. But the war in Europe, the death, the destruction, the hybrid war of Russia and China here, and the dangerous situation we face, these realities matter now here in Europe. They are not worth more, and they are not worth less than what happens elsewhere. Anything who would claim that would be racist. And finally, The churches must redefine their own role as diplomatic force and as peace dealers. They must do so more modestly and less with great prophetic claims. And I'm sorry to disagree with you, Sophia. I think more on a smaller scale, less visible, more concretely, and always out of a warm Christian responsibility. They sound not very much, but I'm also happy and lucky that I'm a historian and not a church person who is taking over responsibility in this very situation. And so I thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that my looking back into the history gives you some idea of what the CAC is, but also make you free to find your own way in Europe today.
Thank you, Professor Kunda. We still have time for some questions and comments. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for such a wonderful presentation. And after having heard your lecture being delivered, I would like to raise another glass of champagne for the renewal of CAC. Having said that, my questions are, I think the subjects you tackled today are extremely important. We as CAC have neglected the weak. Do you think we need to repent and apologize for that to build a new future? I think you were absolutely right in saying that peace conference was definitely KGB project. But CAC was influenced by the state influence, Soviet state influence in its work and ministry. So do you think time has come when we as CAC should reflect on it, to talk about it openly and candidly? Or do you think it is too early to dig into the past? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, and this goes into the heart, I think, of how we should deal with history and present. I think you are absolutely right that CAC has neglected the weak, and I think it's time to apologize and to put it on the agenda. If you think about, and you were also on the conference, these Christian dissidents, they are now in the 80s, some maybe in the 70s, but in the 80s. And they never heard something of the ecumenical bodies. There were some smaller attempts in the 1990s of some Kirchentag, but never something officially, because no one of these ecumenical circles took this topic over. And, for example, invited those Christian dissidents who were brave Christians with Christian backgrounds. And I think that is on the time, not only for the future, because this generation is still active and still relying on their visions of democracy, of human rights, and very active, but this generation is not very long living anymore. And the sooner the CAC, for example, could do that, the better. It's not much time to lose. And then on the other side, I also noticed I was traveling very, very often in Eastern Europe in the 90s and also in the early years of 2000. I noticed that the ecumenical movement had lost a lot of good people, good Christians, who were disappointed about that, and who also knew that there were these too close to the state church representatives in the CAC, and still partly they were still acting afterwards as church representatives as well. In Germany at the moment there's also starting some processes of the churches to take over this role and to apologize by those, and this is an initiative coming from the church leaderships to say also we as church had not always done what we should have done. And it's very difficult, but I think it would be worthwhile for the CAC to do that, definitely.
a brief remark to continue this conversation. At Tallinn, we heard from the situation in Belarus. And I would like to connect this issue with, I see an obligation from KEC to include as much as possible those Christians that are struggling in Belarus at present, and have them included in our ecumenical society and gatherings. And we promised almost ourselves that in Tallinn, but we have not really succeeded with that. And I see that is in close connection to what you're talking about.
Yes, we will take.
Thank you very much for this really brilliant overview. And if I understood you well, you describe a change in this international church work when in the beginning we had platforms like KEC as let's say a parallel structure to state diplomacy for the churches. And I think it was Basel that you said was the point where it swifted rather to being a civil society project. And I'm a little bit more interested. Maybe you could say more on how this change came into being, because you could argue that this is more or less a reaction to this out society factors like secularization. Churches are not as big anymore. They are not. They do not have the state church status as strong as it was before. But is this shift maybe also theologically reflected, or is there a different ecclesiology behind it? So that would be my request to elaborate a little bit more on this.
Yeah, of course, this has to do with the whole developments in post-war Europe, and especially with the long, we historians say always, the long 60s. So these liberation movements, grassroots movements in different kind of the Western European and American society, this idea that there is not this strict top-down model of society, but that there is something which can change the society from below. And the churches were in that kind, I would say, also very late. There were other parts of the society who were very quicker in adopt these new models of the whole liberation and emancipation movements of the 1960s and 70s. And definitely in Eastern Europe, the structure of the society was much more the old pre-war idea that state and church were on the same level, and that they, when they are talking with each other, they act as on the same level, and they had not really an idea that it matters bottom up. Of course, this was an illusion, and also I think from the perspective of the socialist state representatives, they were overestimating the churches, and they were always keeping this balance on the state-church relations. But then in Basel, I think what came up there is that for the first time this secular trend of what does it mean to be a modern pluralistic society swept into the churches, swept into the European churches, into the KEC and the members, and that also the idea that those young Christians mostly who are active in Christian groups, fighting for human rights, for democracy, or being active in environmental issues, that they belong to the church. But this was not clear from the theological and ecclesiastical point of view, and I came across a lot of discussions in the mid of the 80s in GDR circles, where there was this discussions belonging these groups who are meeting under the umbrella and in the churches. Are they church in ecclesiastical terms? And the answer of the leading bishops in GDR was no, they are not church. And there were only a few who were saying, no, they are part of the church. They are Christians. They are active in issues which belong to Christianity, so they are part of the church. But that was a minority view in that time. And I think that has completely changed nowadays in our whole understanding of what churches are nowadays in Europe. So this old model is not any longer working.
I want to thank you for your presentation. I come here as a guest from Canada, but I lived in Berlin in 1989. And the first time that I crossed the Berlin Wall, there was a theology student who gave me a medallion. It was Schwerte zu Pflugschal, and said to me, "Don't wear this in public." But I experienced this revolution, and I must confess that your historical panorama has given me tons of insight into what was going on at the time, much of which we can't discuss here. But what you said about the people, the young people who were they church or were they not church? I remember the Monday evening demonstrations that happened mostly in Leipzig, but then also in Berlin later on. One thing that they did, I went to one worship service there on a Monday evening when the church, Evangelische Kirche, was packed to the rafters. And the main thing, they sang a song and they prayed a prayer, but then they named the individual people who had been beaten and arrested and who had disappeared, and there was silence, and there was a list of the names of the people. And then that was essentially all that happened. But then we went out into the streets, and there was thousands of people there. And every Monday they came back, and was this where church was happening? You know, I resonate with your call for being Christian at the grassroots. But at the same time, I'm only beginning to understand what impact we can also have institutionally and governmentally. This dynamic has become very rich and very real to me through your presentation. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Katarina, for again a very important presentation. And I recall that I spoke to the chairperson of the National Council of International Relations in the Lutheran Church, Johannes Langhoff. You may not know him, but he's one of the most important church persons after Second World War in Denmark, as far as I see. And he was in Helsinki, and he told me the history or how they did it. That when the diplomats entered into the plenary hall, all the KEK people, they were standing alongside the aisle where they had to pass through, and then they gave them documents and papers and ideas of what to put into the fourth basket. And I didn't really get you if you were talking also about the fourth basket, because as far as I'm concerned, the fourth basket about social human relationships perhaps is the most important part, where KEK played a great deal of importance, because that opened up the possibility that we could meet, we could travel. And for me at least, if you see this in the long perspective, from 1975 over 1983, when they started the Monday afternoon worships in Leipzig and other places up till 1989, I think there is a very dramatic story that we should tell also from the KEK perspective. And I totally agree with you that this needs a very concerned elaboration of the role of KEK, but I think it is much more mixed, positive and negatively during those years, and especially if you take the role of the ecumenical movement in this long 15 years perspective. But thank you very much.
Yeah, I was concentrating on 75 because this is now also the Jubilee. But of course there were a lot of follow-ups in the Helsinki process with different contributions of the churches and the ecumenical actors. But in 75 the situation was that the churches and also the CEC did not have access to the material and the discussions. The only church body who had access and was part of the Helsinki process was the Vatican. And the Vatican opened up the offices and the diplomatic offices for the churches and shared the material. And the most frequent, let's say, visitor of the Vatican was the Lutheran World Federation. So they were doing it in some ways better than maybe the other churches, and that also has to do that then afterwards, quite soon after the agreement, the Lutheran World Federation was following the Vatican's line and saying we as Lutheran World Federation are picking up to and sticking up to the religious freedom. Then the other developments which you have mentioned came partly later, and then also it developed in a different case. But in this early beginning, and I would say still, it was difficult, and I hope you got it also, how difficult it is for a church to do something and to open up space when you are in a bipolar situation and do not have really power access. So this is the dilemma of the CEC in this period.
We will take the two final questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I would like just come back to this topic of dissidents and to my father from the Orthodox Church Armenia as well. Not all of them were actually KGB people, because there are lots of Hungarian pastors, for instance, István Széfalusi in Vienna, Robert Pátkai in London, László Terra in Norway, István Gémes in Stuttgart, or Oliver Job in Switzerland, who had to flee. They had to dissidate to leave Hungary because they were persecuted by the Hungarian security, Stasi. And they all were pastors who founded Hungarian-speaking congregations in all these countries. They took all the Hungarians who had to dissidate and leave Hungary later on. I just wanted to mention their names because it's really important for us, and just also for you to know that all these men were, or pastors were really believers and not the Stasi people. Thank you.
I'm sorry to go along the same line, but first of all, Katarina, many thanks for your outline and walk through the history, and especially thanks for what I believe we do not hear very often, and I'm glad that we heard it today. This recognition of the work of dissidents in former communist countries, and I believe this is something what not only CEC, but generally ecumenical movement owes to these people, to recognize what they done during the very difficult past, and what they bring as their sacrifice. I believe this should be, and as you said, the time is short. It needs to be recognized in order to be fair. With that, it is related. The other thing, I grew up in that period of time in those countries. I could also say a lot of personal stories of that kind. But what I feel is that what is related with this part of conflicting and challenging history, which is still not sufficiently elaborated, different understanding what ecumenism is. As we sit in this room, we believe that we understand ecumenism. We are engaged. It is something good we have to work for. But it is not for everyone like that. And for quite a significant number of people, especially in what is now called post-communist world, ecumenism is not so clean word, because it is linked to to engagement of a state, influence of a state, and state services. So I think more sensitivism and openness to different understanding what ecumenism is, and thanks God it is now changing with the new generation coming. But the old generation, there are still people who feels hurt, not recognized, and pushed aside from their own communities as well as from international ecumenical community. And I very much appreciated the sentence of former General Secretary of World Council of Churches after he left the office. In one of the conversations he said, "This was my major mistake in my office of being General Secretary of World Council of Churches, not recognize this painful history of ecumenism." So I believe we could do better, and we should. Yes.
Do you have any concluding?
Not a concluding, just also not an answer, and also to yours. I think we also have to collect these names and persons and biographies. That could be maybe also a project for the KEC. And I didn't want to say that everybody who was from Eastern Europe active in the KEC was KGB, Stasi, or Secret Service. Definitely not. But there is an amount of people who were very pro-socialist, even if they were working or not working. And the others, and that was my point I wanted to make, the other voices were not getting a platform in the ecumenical circles in these times. And I can also say maybe 3 names which belong to the institutional history of the KEC, and especially in the educational programs of the KEC. So we had Gyula Norci, we had Theo Chui, and we had Gerhard Linn. These were officers, paid persons of the KEC in that time, and were responsible for the educational systems. And if you are looking what they were doing, they were exactly doing what I tried to describe, arguing in these peaceful coexistence line, very pro-socialistic in some ways, even if they maybe were not aware of that. And then I can also see Gerhard Linn, who was in 1989 in Geneva. I have seen his records, who has written, he was coming from GDR, and there were, after Basel, were some letters and some questions to the KEC, and what is about these dissidents, these young people who are active now in grassroots level movements? Is this something we should consider? And Gerhard Linn was just saying, no, there's nothing going on, not important. So he was downplaying this phenomenon. And now I have not done research to look what was his aim after that, but this belongs also to the history of the KEC, to look closely on those persons who had taken over responsibility in that period in Geneva in the offices.
Thank you, Professor Kunda. Yeah, I know. Thank you, Professor Kunda, and I think we will we'll close this session with those final comments.